Hey guys, welcome back to another video. It is me, the Mysterious Cameraman, and today we are starting our adventure through many of Christopher Nolan's best movies and discussing the way that he plays with time within them. We're starting off with Memento, which is one of my personal one of my favorite Christopher Nolan films just because it's so interesting. I wouldn't say it's like one of my top 5, but I really love this film and I think it is definitely such an interesting way that it plays with time, because in this film, the function of time is that it's forgotten. So what I really love about Memento, and this is going to act as both a Memento review and also a Memento video essay on why it's so brilliant the way that time is used. But for me at least, I had a very interesting relationship when I first watched Memento and then the second time. I think the first time I watched it, I liked it, but I didn't like it for the right reasons. I think I came out of the film and I was like, I think it's such a brilliant way to do storytelling. I love the way that, if you don't know how Memento works, each scene is in reverse. So the scenes itself are in order, but they're in reverse chronological order. So you'll watch the scene in full, and then the next scene will pick up earlier, and then it will end with the start of the previous scene. So it's a really interesting function for the film. And meanwhile, we have this black and white portion of the film where we don't fully know what's going on. There are a lot shorter scenes than the scenes that are in color at first. And for the majority of the film, there's this function of these longer color scenes that are just bouncing between each other, and these shorter, more vignette black and white scenes where we see him on the phone or not much happening, or him doing the tattoos. But really, we're seeing the color things being the more interesting ones, the more interactive ones, and the black and white's more like the investigation, the private part. And we see this function throughout the whole film until the film merges at the end of it. But on that journey, I think it's such a fascinating way that the story is told. Because I think the way that it functions is that, as I explained, how each scene ends, and then the next scene has to start somewhere else, and then that scene ends with the beginning of the previous one. It's such a fascinating function. When I came out of my first watch, I said, I love that storytelling technique, but I didn't love the story. And I started doing some reading into Memento. I started watching videos, interviews with Christopher Nolan. I think most people have at this point seen the U-shaped figure that he uses for Memento, which I think explains it brilliantly. Obviously, he directed it, he would know. But I really love that explanation of it. But what I started to notice, especially once I did my second rewatch, is I believe it was an interview with Christopher Nolan, but I'm not sure. I could be wrong on this. But I remember seeing somewhere that there was someone who said, this film is interesting because of the function. And if this film was in chronological order, it wouldn't be that interesting. And I think what I noticed on my second rewatch is that the film is great, and the reason why people love this film is because of the way it's told. They love the way that the structure of the storytelling, the fact that each scene builds off each other, so it's this mystery that you're playing in your head. And I'll say it's one of the most interactive films I've definitely watched, especially from Christopher Nolan, because there are a ton of Christopher Nolan films that feel a little bit different. I'll say my next video is going to be on Tenet, and that film is a film I love, and I have a very interesting relationship with it. And I think this film specifically, the function of time defines the film. So when you're watching it, it feels more like a brain teaser. How did you get there? Where is it going to end? And then you're figuring out, and you're like, oh, that's going to end there. But then how does he end there? And you're putting notes in your mind. So I really like how it simulates how the main character also goes throughout his world. Because the way that he forgets things, he also has to pick up where he left off and doesn't really know where that is. So I think that's such a fascinating way to tell it, because I think Christopher Nolan had a really challenging problem, which was to say, how do I solve this issue? How do I make it so the audience is interested in this and can experience the way that the main character is losing his thoughts? And I feel like having it cut and then going backwards and backwards, I think is such a fascinating way to do it. My struggle with Memento, and the reason why it's not higher on my list as much as I want it to be, is I think once you figure it out and once you realize the plot twist, I think when you're watching the movie, especially what I saw in my second watch, is because I knew where some scenes were going to pick up and leave off. It was definitely interesting and a brain teaser, but it didn't feel like it was as hard to follow. And I think more than that, I think I had to live in the scenes more. And what I kind of noticed is that I really wasn't so interested in the plot of it all. I think this film comes together in the last 15 minutes when the black and white transitions to color. And we learn how this isn't the first person he's murdered, how he's done it again and again, how it's a cycle. I think that's such a fascinating thing. And it recontextualizes the whole plot. So when you rewatch it, you're suddenly watching it as, This is not just the murder, this is another person he's just killed to kill because that's what's going to give him purpose. So he's just going around the cycle again and again, trying to figure out who a killer is, what makes someone innocent and guilty. I think it's such a fascinating method to tell the story. And I think to contrast that, I think the concept, the themes, the ideas of the story do not save the story itself. And I think there are times that I'm watching it where I'm not that interested in what's going on, especially when I know what's happening on my rewatches, because I think the first watch is a very rewarding mind teaser. But I don't think aside from that, I don't think the plot itself can sustain the structure. I think, sadly, or just the way it is, there couldn't be such a more interesting plot, because if the plot was so much more interesting, it would be a lot harder to follow with the structure of the film. So I think because it's such an ambitious structure, I think the plot has to suffer with that. However, I think that just leads to where I kind of struggle with it, because I think the structure is incredible, and I think that defines the film for me. And I think when I think back on it, and I think about what I liked about this film, I didn't love all the interior of the film. I didn't love everything the film was doing. I felt like there were a lot of scenes that dragged on. And I think it was fascinating the way that these characters acted with the main character. And I really did love a lot of the themes of it and the questions it posed. But I think the scenes itself sometimes just lacked some interest. Because I think especially when you put together the puzzle a second time, I feel like there were plenty of things that are interesting. I love the way that different characters use the main character to get what they want, to figure out where their purpose is in this world, things like that, how they're going to move forward from their current place in the world. I think there are so many fascinating questions that the movie raises. And I think on the flip side of that, there's just a lot of struggles that I personally have when I'm watching this film, simply because I just think there are some scenes that feel very empty, because even though there are so many thematic parts of this film that I think are great, there are some parts of this film that I just don't think live up to the standards that the structure is. Because I think also, kind of to the film's detriment, because the structure is so great, it's kind of like, why isn't the plot on that level? Obviously there are reasons. And I really love a lot of this film. I want to make it clear, I still love this film. I love the way, I think I really do love this film. It's like a 9 out of 10 for me. I love the way that the photos work and the things like that, and the Polaroids. I love that. I just think the reason why it's not one of my favorite Christopher Nolan films, and I think the reason why some people, for example, when I look on TikTok or Instagram and I see people do their Nolan rankings, I feel like Memento is either 1, 2, or 3, or like 7 or 8. And the reason why I think is everyone can agree that it's such a brilliant storytelling technique, and it's one of the most interesting films you're going to see. And on the flip side of that, I think the plot itself, I think, isn't as interesting. At least from my perspective, I think it led to the structure being what I was following instead of the plot. And I think that's just a very interesting thing. But now let's get into the actual analysis of the film. The way time functions in this film is very different from almost any other Christopher Nolan film, because in other films, you normally have multiple different plots running simultaneously. You have things deep into the future or themes deep into the past, and normally they don't converge. Normally what happens is this is happening, and they do sometimes meet towards the very end, but normally you're not meeting in the middle. So instead of it being a past, middle, future, or past and future, or whatever, maybe present, past, whatever the duo trio is, whatever the storyline is being told are, normally they just meet and then they keep going towards the end, towards the final point, and then you can linearize the film. What happens here is the film works in this U shape, so it's folded on top of each other. So what that leads to is this film's no longer multiple things running parallel telling the same story. It's now these two almost contradictory stories, because you have one story in the past that is directly leading to the future, and one story in the future that can't happen without the past, but they aren't necessarily benefiting each other in the same way. And I think it's such a fascinating way to tell the story, because it's not as conjoined. You're not piecing together where the past and the future is until the color merges with the black and white. That's when you realize the twist. It's very hard to tell earlier up to that point when the black and white's taking place and when the color is. And I think part of what makes this film so rewarding, especially as you watch it the second time, is that you kind of know what's going on, but I think the first time, what's so fascinating is that you have these two plots running simultaneously, side by side, and there are certain plot points you're following. I think the biggest one is the picture of the main antagonist who he kills at the start of the movie. And we're falling for, I'm blanking on his name right now. But that character, on the back it says, "Don't believe his lies," whatever it may be. It is so fascinating to go throughout the movie and have that written on it, and you never really know why it was written there. You don't know until the final scene in the film where you realize why he wrote "Don't believe his lies" on it. And suddenly, it recontextualizes everything, because he's making himself this hero to benefit his future self. In his past, as many mistakes as he's making, he's allowing himself to be ignorant with this forgetfulness, which allows him to just move into the future and just be this villain that he is. He doesn't have to be a hero, he can just be whoever he wants, because he's just going to forget it. So he is this hero, in his mind at least, but to the world he's a villain. But he never wants to play the villain, he never wants to admit to his past mistakes, and he never can admit to his past mistakes. So instead what he does is he takes the past, all of his mistakes, and he just allows it to be forgotten and dictates his own future based on these Polaroid pictures. Because what's so fascinating is there are so many times that we meet these people, and they aren't trustworthy, they're trying to take advantage of him, but he's also taking advantage of himself. He's allowing himself to just follow these aimless clues that he knows he can trust because he himself wrote it. But he himself is also lying to himself. He's telling himself these things that he shouldn't be trusting, just so that he can move forward with his life and believe that he's doing the right thing so he can live in bliss. And I think one of the most incredible things that this story tells is, like, is ignorance bliss or is ignorance a crime? And I think when you look at this film and you look at the structure of it, what I really love about it, one of the things I think is most fascinating about it, is that when time is working, we as the audience are in ignorance. We don't know what's coming next. We don't know who's the hero and the villain. And we enjoy that. We want to figure it out. Like, just in the same way he wants to find a killer. But we just keep moving along. We keep following along the path because we still want to find out. We want to end the ignorance. And we are also content with being happy. We're content with not necessarily knowing what comes next because we're happy with the scenes we're living in now. So when we forget, when we move on texting, we're trying to figure out, but once we are in that scene, we're happy with it. And then we move on to the next one because we know where it's going, but we don't know what came before. So it adds this very interesting layer to not just how is the main character feeling and how are we understanding it, but also now the audience is playing this game of, is ignorance bliss or not? And do they want to know how the story ends? Because what does that admit to themselves by the time they get to the end, and whether or not they're right about how they solve the puzzle and what this story is really telling. So I think this movie isn't just a test of what the main character is doing, the way that structure goes, but also how the audience is going to understand and perceive this movie. So with that, that's my like breakdown, analysis, and also my review of Memento. I really love this movie. I love the way that time is reversed. Oh my god, not time is reversed. Time is forgotten in this one. Time in reverse is going to come in a little bit with Tenet, or that time is inverted. I'm not sure, but I really love this film. I love so many things about it. I think this film is genuinely fascinating, and I think you all should check it out. It's a really great brain teaser and a fun puzzle to put together. And that's my review on Memento and how time is forgotten. Thank you all so much for watching. I'll see you in the next one. Bye, guys.